Hardtack and Coffee, A Soldier's Life in the Civil War is a classic memoir written by John D. Billings, first published in 1887. This engaging account provides a vivid and often humorous look into the daily lives of Union soldiers during the American Civil War. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe. These are Billings' words. Let's begin. If there is one group of people in this country who should truly appreciate spacious, well-graded highways and reliable methods of transportation, it is the veterans of the Union Army. Those who marched on foot for 2 to 4 years through the South traveled more miles across rugged terrain during that time than they ever did on proper roads. They navigated dense forests, open fields, swamps, and rivers of varying depths. Along the way, they tore down fences that blocked their path, filled ditches with rails to allow artillery to pass, and found shortcuts whenever possible. These shortcuts were so common and practical that soldiers endured the challenges they presented with remarkable good humor, knowing that every mile saved meant fewer blisters and an earlier arrival at camp. However, not all parts of the Army had the luxury of taking shortcuts. Some units had to find a way or make it, or rely on others to create one for them. Constructing such routes required time, skill, and a great deal of labor. To meet this need, a specialized group was enlisted for this exact purpose, the Engineer Corps. Often called the sappers and miners of the Army, they performed very little actual sapping and mining, which was typically handled by combat forces. For this reason, I will refer to this group as engineers, the name they preferred. In the Army of the Potomac, the Engineer Corps consisted of the 15th and 50th New York regiments of volunteers and a battalion of regulars made up of 3 companies. They began their service under McClellan during the Peninsular Campaign and remained closely associated with the Army until the end of the war. These engineers were armed as infantry solely for self-defense, as fighting was not their primary role. On rare occasions, they were drawn up in battle lines during emergencies, such as at Antietam, Gettysburg, and the Wilderness, though they were not expected to actively engage in combat. The engineers' primary duties were to ensure roads were passable for the Army. This included corduroying swampy areas, building trestle bridges over small streams, laying pontoon bridges across rivers, dismantling those bridges when needed, constructing fortifications, and clearing trees and other obstacles, a task known as slashing. Corduroying often required enormous effort because the Virginia mud was a significant obstacle to rapid movement. Miles of corduroy roads had to be laid to maintain communication between different parts of the Army. When the ground was especially swampy, 2 logs, called stringers, were laid parallel to the direction of the road, and smaller logs, usually around 4 inches in diameter, were placed across them to create a stable surface. In less severe muddy conditions, stringers were not necessary. Sometimes, brush was spread over the surface to prevent mules from sinking their legs into the gaps. Although the engineers oversaw this work, most of the labor was performed by fatigue details from the infantry. The engineers alone could not have completed even a fifth of the tasks assigned to them within the necessary time. This observation does not diminish the engineers' efforts, as they consistently performed their duties well. Rather, it highlights the contributions of the infantry, who frequently added engineering tasks to their already demanding responsibilities. To support this work, the quartermaster of the Army kept wagons filled with entrenching tools ready to supply the troops whenever their assistance as engineers was required. The role of the engineers was indispensable, and their contributions played a critical part in maintaining the Army's mobility and effectiveness throughout the war. The construction of trestle bridges required significant labor from the engineers of the Army of the Potomac, as Virginia is crisscrossed with numerous small streams. While troops could easily ford these streams, heavily loaded supply trains could not. Without bridges, fords would quickly become impassable, clogged with mired wagons and teams. Occasionally, bridges built by local residents remained intact, but these structures were originally designed for light local traffic and were not strong enough to handle the constant weight and strain of a moving army and its enormous loads. The engineers would then reinforce or rebuild these bridges to meet the Army's needs. Their work was so well executed that many of these structures remain standing today, serving as a testament to their dedication and a convenience for the local population. When fortifications were constructed in wooded areas, extensive tree felling, known as slashing, was often necessary to clear the front. This was especially important in front of forts and artillery batteries. Engineers would cut down trees with their tops facing the enemy, leaving stumps about 3 feet high. The area covered by these fallen trees was referred to as the slashes. Such an obstacle was nearly impossible for large enemy forces to penetrate, providing a strong defense for even relatively weak fortifications. The engineers were also responsible for creating various defensive structures, including gabions, fascines, chevaux de frise, abatis, and fraises. Gabions were hollow, bottomless cylinders made of wickerwork, filled with earth, and placed on top of earthworks to reinforce them. Fascines were bundles of small sticks bound together at both ends and intermediate points, used for raising batteries and filling ditches. Chevaux de frise consisted of wooden beams studded with long spikes, designed to deter cavalry charges. Abatis involved large tree branches, sharpened at one end and laid close together with the points facing outward, while the butts were pinned to the ground to form a dense barrier. Fraises were rows of pointed sticks driven into the ground at an angle, with the tips positioned at chest height, creating an effective defense against advancing infantry. All these defensive measures were produced in vast quantities by the Engineer Corps, particularly during the Siege of Petersburg in 1864. Their meticulous work not only enhanced the Army's fortifications but also played a critical role in ensuring its operational success. The most remarkable work performed by the Engineer Corps, in my opinion, and the one for which they are likely to be remembered the longest, was the laying of pontoon bridges. The word pontoon comes from both Spanish and French, ultimately derived from the Latin word pons, meaning bridge. Over time, the term has come to refer specifically to the floating boats used to create these bridges, and those who construct them are called pontonniers in French. The pontoon bridge system used during the Civil War was almost an exact copy of the French model. The earliest recorded pontoon bridge in history was built nearly 2,400 years ago by Xerxes, across the Hellespont. This bridge, over 4,000 feet long, was initially destroyed by a storm. In retaliation, Xerxes ordered the sea whipped 300 times, threw shackles into it, and executed the workers responsible for its construction. He then commissioned 2 new bridges, one for his army and the other for baggage and beasts of burden. These bridges were built with 360 vessels, including some with 3 banks of oars and others with 50 oars, anchored on both sides to resist winds and currents. Gaps were left for smaller boats to pass through. Massive cables, some made of hemp and others of reed, were stretched across the vessels to secure them. Over the cables, workers laid logs, planks, and a covering of earth, with railings on either side to prevent horses and cattle from being frightened by the sight of the sea during their crossing. In comparing Xerxes' ancient bridge to those used during the Civil War, many similarities can be noted, although the materials and techniques evolved considerably over time. One of the earliest types of pontoon bridges used during the Civil War was constructed with inflatable India rubber pontoons. These pontoons, shaped like torpedoes, were inflated before use. Once inflated, 2 were placed side by side, creating a buoyant base for the bridge. Their lightweight construction made them easy to transport, but for reasons unclear, they were not widely adopted by the engineers of the Army of the Potomac. However, they were used in the Western campaigns, including by General F. P. Blair's division during the Vicksburg campaign in 1863. Another type of pontoon, used primarily by Sherman's army, was a canvas-covered skeleton boat frame. This design replaced earlier frames made of tin or copper, which had been deemed impractical. These canvas pontoons were lightweight and versatile. Each pontoon was designed to fold into a wagon body for transport, where the canvas cover, anchors, chains, and other materials could also be stored. Sherman distributed approximately 900 feet of pontoon bridge material to each of his 4 corps during the march to Savannah. This type of bridge was also used by the volunteer engineers of the Army of the Potomac. For instance, a canvas pontoon bridge spanned the Rapidan River at Ely's Ford on the night of May 3, 1864, allowing the 2nd Corps to cross at the start of the Wilderness Campaign. Another bridge was laid across the Po River by the 50th New York Engineers on May 10, 1864, enabling Hancock's veterans to cross after a fierce battle earlier that day. The longer and more permanent pontoon bridges, such as those crossing the Chickahominy, James, and Appomattox rivers, were supported by wooden boats based on the French design. These boats were 31 feet long, 5 feet 4 inches wide at the top, 4 feet wide at the bottom, and 2 feet 6 inches deep. Their near-rectangular shape, with minimal tapering at the bow and stern, made them stable platforms for bridge construction. The bridge floor was built using timbers called balks, each 25.5 feet long and 4.5 inches square at the ends. 5 continuous lines of balks were placed on the boats, spaced 2 feet 10 inches apart. The flooring, known as chesses, consisted of 14-foot-long planks that were 12 inches wide and 1.5 inches thick. To secure the chesses in place, side rails of similar dimensions to the box were laid over the outer box and fastened with cords called rack lashings. The span between the centers of two boats, called a bay, measured 13 feet 10 inches. The width of the bridge roadway, defined by the side rails, was 11 feet. These dimensions provided a sturdy and reliable surface for troops, wagons, and artillery to cross, even under challenging conditions. At each end of a pontoon bridge, an abutment needed to be constructed. This was usually done by setting a heavy timber horizontally in the ground, level with the top of the bridge, and securing it with stakes. The approach to the abutment was then prepared, either by grading the ground, laying corduroy, or cutting away part of the bank. The boats and all the other bridge materials were transported on wagons collectively known as the pontoon train. Each wagon was drawn by 6 mules. A single boat, along with its anchor and cable, made up the entire load for one wagon. The box, chesses, and side rails were transported separately on other wagons. This systematic organization allowed the pontooniers to work efficiently. In camp, the pontoon train was usually located near Army headquarters, while on the march, it followed behind the Army unless its use was anticipated. Whenever the column halted and the pontoon train and its engineer guards moved to the front, it was a clear signal to the troops that a river crossing lay ahead. Soldiers would often take this as a cue to rest, cook coffee, or even take a nap while waiting. To better understand the process of laying a pontoon bridge, let us follow a pontoon train to the river and observe the steps involved. If the enemy did not occupy the opposite bank, the wagons would be driven as close as possible to the water's edge. The materials were then unloaded, and the wagons moved aside. To ensure efficiency and minimize confusion, the engineering corps was divided into specialized teams: abutment, boat, balk, lashing, chess, and side rail parties. Each group had a specific task, and every man knew his role. The abutment party began by constructing the abutment and preparing the approaches. If the shore was marshy, trestle work or a crib made of logs might be needed, but such cases were uncommon since the Army typically approached rivers via recognized roads or paths. While the abutment party worked onshore, the boat party launched a pontoon. 6 men rowed the boat to a point upstream of the intended bridge line, dropped anchor, and allowed the boat to drift downstream until it reached the abutment. Once there, they secured it to the shore. Meanwhile, the balk party arrived with 5 balks, each carried by 2 men. The balks were laid across the pontoon, with one end projecting about 6 inches beyond the outer gunwale of the boat. The lashing party followed to secure the balks in place at intervals marked on the gunwales. After this, the pontoon was pushed into the water to the length of the balks, allowing the shore ends of the balks to be fastened to the abutment. The chess party then laid flooring planks, known as chesses, over the balks, leaving about 1 foot of space before reaching the pontoon. While this was happening, the boat party launched a second pontoon, anchored it in place, and positioned it alongside the first. The balk party then laid another set of balks, which were secured by the lashing party. The second pontoon was pushed off into the water, and the balks were positioned to overlap the first boat, creating a continuous span. The chess party followed, extending the flooring across the new section. As the third section of the bridge began, the side rail party joined in. They placed side rails on the chesses over the outer balks and lashed them securely in place. The chesses were designed to accommodate these lashings, with spaces between the boards allowing the cords to pass through. This sequence was repeated bay after bay until the bridge reached the far shore. There, the construction of another abutment and approach completed the bridge. To protect the bridge's roadway from wear, it was often covered with hay, straw, or sand. The engineers would then inspect the bridge, making any necessary adjustments to ensure it was straight and secure. Once finished, the bridge was ready for use, allowing troops and supplies to cross safely. However, movement across the bridge was strictly controlled. Soldiers and animals were required to cross at a walk to prevent undue strain on the structure. Guards were posted at the abutments and along the bridge to enforce this rule, issuing commands like route step, to keep soldiers from marching in unison, which could create a dangerous rhythmic strain on the bridge. When dismantling a bridge, the engineers worked in reverse order, starting at the end nearest the enemy. The chesses and balks were carried back by hand to the other shore. To speed up the process, engineers sometimes weighed anchor and allowed the bridge to swing to the near shore, where it could be taken apart. This maneuver was performed with particular urgency after the Army of the Potomac recrossed the Rappahannock following the Battle of Chancellorsville. Fearing an enemy attack, the engineers cut the cables and let the bridge float downstream, relieved to avoid interference during the operation. One historian described the engineers as grasping not the musket but the hammer. While this poetic remark captured their non-combatant role, it was somewhat misleading, as no nails were driven into the bridge at any point during its construction. The entire process relied on precision, coordination, and ingenuity, hallmarks of the Engineer Corps' vital contributions to the Union Army's success. When the Army of the Potomac retreated from Richmond in 1862, it crossed the lower Chickahominy River using a bridge of boats and rafts that spanned 1,980 feet. This bridge was constructed by three separate work parties working simultaneously, one at each end and one in the center. It was the longest bridge built during the war, except for one other, the bridge constructed across the James River near Wilcox's Landing in 1864. This latter bridge was an extraordinary feat of pontoon engineering. Spanning over 2,000 feet, it was anchored securely in a channel with a depth of 13 fathoms. Under the direction of General Benham, the engineers began work on the morning of June 14 and completed the bridge by midnight. It facilitated the passage of wagon trains and some troops, while others crossed the river using steamers and ferry boats. Pontoon bridges were not always laid without resistance from the enemy. One of the most intense contests occurred during the attempt to lay bridges across the Rappahannock River near Fredericksburg in December 1862. The Pontoniers had partially laid one bridge under the cover of darkness, but at dawn, enemy sharpshooters, stationed in buildings on the opposite bank, opened a devastating fire. Their deadly aim forced the engineers to abandon their work. Two subsequent attempts to continue construction, though made with great determination, were also thwarted by the sharpshooters armed with Mississippi rifles. Eventually, three regiments, the 7th Michigan and the 19th and 20th Massachusetts, volunteered to cross the river and dislodge the enemy. They performed this task heroically, albeit at considerable cost. Crossing in pontoon boats, they stormed the steep opposite bank, engaged the enemy in fierce combat, and either drove them out or captured them. This daring assault enabled the completion of the first pontoon bridge, with others soon following nearby. The engineers suffered more casualties here, in actual combat, than in all their other operations during the war combined. Pontoon bridges were a source of fascination and reassurance for the soldiers who used them. Their stability and steadiness were remarkable. Marching across one with a column of troops or wagons felt as solid as walking on land. There was no swaying or discernible movement to unsettle the soldiers. One memorable incident occurred during a night crossing of the Appomattox River at Point of Rocks. D. Webster Atkinson, a cannoneer known for his towering height of over 6 feet, was nearly asleep from the exhaustion of an all-night march. In his fatigue, he stepped off the bridge, not into deep water but into a pontoon boat. The unexpected 2.5-foot drop jolted him awake, but apart from some minor soreness, he was unharmed. The engineers, as a group, led a relatively privileged life compared to the infantry. While their labor was exhausting when required, they were generally afforded better conditions and greater respect. They were a highly skilled and accomplished corps, performing their duties with precision and dedication. There was no finer body of men in the Army. The engineers' winter quarters were some of the most distinctive and impressive in the entire Army. Their mechanical skill was fully evident in the construction of these quarters, particularly during the winter of 1863 to 1864. The officers' quarters were often designed with rustic flair, featuring intricate and unique designs. One regiment built their homes from undressed cedar, giving the settlement a quaint, comfortable, and visually striking appearance. The engineers also improved their living conditions with corduroyed streets and even wooden sidewalks. A notable example of their craftsmanship was Poplar Grove Church, built by the 50th New York Engineers in 1864, a few miles south of Petersburg. The church remains standing today as a testament to their skill and ingenuity in rustic design. Yes, there were flags in the Army that talked for the soldiers, and few topics are as engaging as how they did it, when they did it, and why. All flags used in the service had stories to tell. What could be more eloquent than Old Glory, with its 13 stripes reminding us of the nation's humble beginnings, and its blue field, originally featuring the cross of the English flag when Washington first raised it in Cambridge, later replaced by a cluster of stars representing the states of the Union. The history of this emblem is so rich it almost seems to speak for itself. The corps, division, and brigade flags also told their own stories, as described previously. However, there were other flags whose sole purpose was to communicate messages to one another, and the stories they told were immediately written down for the benefit of soldiers or sailors. These were signal flags, wielded by the men of the Signal Corps, whose job was to make the flags talk. The purpose of the Signal Corps was to enable rapid and frequent communication between different parts of the land or naval forces. Whether the army was engaged with the enemy, on the march, or in camp, the signalmen with their flags proved invaluable. In battle, their role was often critical. To understand how this began, let's look at the origins of the Signal Corps. The system of signals used in both armies during the Civil War was developed by one man, Albert J. Meyer. Born in Newburgh, New York, Meyer entered the Army as an assistant surgeon in 1854. While stationed in New Mexico, he recognized the need for a faster communication method than relying on messengers. This insight, combined with his prior studies, led him to develop a system of motion telegraphy. Recognizing the potential value of his system, Congress created the position of Chief Signal Officer, and President Buchanan appointed Meyer to the role. Until 1863, Meyer was not only the Chief Signal Officer but the only one formally commissioned. All other members of the Signal Corps were acting officers, detached from various regiments. Interestingly, one officer Meyer had trained in New Mexico joined the Confederacy when the war broke out and organized a Signal Corps for the enemy. From these small beginnings, the Signal Corps grew. Once its importance was recognized, details of men were taken from regiments around Washington and placed in camps of instruction to learn how to use the signal kit. This kit included a series of 7 flags, ranging from 2 to 6 feet square. 3 of the flags, 6 foot, 4 foot, and 2 foot, were white with a red center square that was 1/3 the flag's dimensions. 2 flags were black with white centers, and 2 were red with white centers. Each flag was attached to a staff whose length varied depending on the flag's size. Larger flags and longer staffs were used for greater distances or when obstacles obstructed the view. However, the 4-foot flag was most commonly used. The purpose of these flags was to communicate visually, not audibly. To ensure clarity, they had to be distinctly visible to the intended recipients. This explains the use of different colors. For example, a white flag with a red center would not be easily seen against a bright sky, so a black flag was used in such cases. Against green or dark backgrounds, the white flag was ideal. In practice, the white flag was used about 9 times out of 10. Before the deaf and mute could be taught to communicate, certain motions were developed to represent specific ideas, letters, and numbers. Similarly, a code was created for signal flags, translating their motions into messages. The flag spoke through movements, each corresponding to a specific letter, number, or word. The signalman began in a default position, with the flag held vertically above his head using both hands. From this position, all motions were made. For example, to signal the letter I or the numeral 2, the flagman waved the flag to the right and immediately returned it to the vertical position. To signal the letter T or the word the flag was waved to the left and returned upright. For 5, the flag was waved directly forward and then brought back to the vertical. The signal code most commonly used during the Civil War consisted of just 2 basic symbols, which made it relatively simple to use. With these 2 symbols, the Signal Corps could communicate not only the letters of the alphabet and numerals but also a vast array of syllables, words, phrases, and detailed messages. In fact, the system included thousands of combinations of numerals, each with a specific meaning. For example, the combination 1 followed by 2, read as 12, represented the letter O. 2 consecutive motions to the right, 22, stood for the letter N, while 3 motions to the right and 1 to the left, 2221, signified the syllable tie-in. By changing combinations, signalers could convey entire messages. For instance, 2122 meant the enemy are advancing, 1122 meant the cavalry have halted, 12211 indicated 3 guns in position, and 1112 signaled 2 miles to the left. These codes were all documented in the official signal codebook. To understand how messages were communicated, let's observe a signal party in action. A complete party typically consisted of 3 members, a commissioned signal officer in charge, equipped with a telescope and field glasses, a flagman with the signal kit, and an orderly to care for the horses if the station was temporary. The team would select a commanding position such as a mountain, hill, treetop, or rooftop for their station. Once the station was established, the signal officer scanned the horizon with his telescope to locate another signal station. Once he identified one, he instructed the flagman to call the station by signaling its assigned number repeatedly until the distant station acknowledged the signal. Each station maintained a lookout specifically to watch for incoming messages. Once communication was established, the signal officer began sending the message. The flagman, who was not expected to know the content of the message, followed the officer's commands and made the corresponding flag motions. At the end of each word, the flagman signaled with a single motion, 5. At the end of a sentence, he signaled 55, and at the end of the entire message, 555. While beginners had to spell out each word letter by letter, experienced signalers used abbreviations to speed up communication. At the receiving station, the officer read the message through his telescope and recorded it. If a word was unclear, the receiving flagman signaled for a repetition, beginning from the last understood word. Such interruptions were rare, thanks to the precision of skilled operators. At night, flags were replaced with talking torches to ensure communication continued. The flagman used a foot torch for reference, keeping it stationary while signaling with a flying torch attached to a staff. These torches, made of copper and filled with turpentine, allowed messages to be sent in much the same way as during the day. At the end of the message, the flying torch was extinguished. Experienced operators could send messages at remarkable speeds. An ordinary message consisting of a few lines could be sent in 10 minutes, and the speed often increased when officers had worked together long enough to understand each other's styles and abbreviations. Messages were typically transmitted over distances of 6 or 7 miles, although longer distances were possible under favorable conditions. One notable example of long-distance signaling occurred in September 1864. Confederate General Hood's army moved to destroy Sherman's railroad communications at Atlanta, targeting the small Union garrison at Allatoona. Sherman, learning of this, signaled a message from Vining's Station to Kennesaw Mountain, then to Allatoona, and finally to Rome, instructing General Corse to move his troops to reinforce Allatoona. Sherman, meanwhile, advanced his main force in the same direction. Upon reaching Kennesaw, Sherman was informed that no response had been received from Allatoona. While at the station, Sherman witnessed the flagman catch a faint glimpse of a distant flag through an embrasure. The message read, CRSCHER, which Sherman correctly interpreted as Corse is here. This message provided vital assurance that Corse had received orders and that Allatoona was adequately defended. Later that day, another famous message was sent between these stations. Allatoona, Georgia, October 6, 1864, 2 p.m. Captain L.M. Dayton, aide-de-camp. I am short a cheekbone and an ear, but am able to whip all hell yet. My losses are heavy. A force moving from Stylesboro to Kingston gives me some anxiety. Tell me where Sherman is. John M. Corse, Brigadier General. The Signal Corps was activated for a wide variety of tasks, but they were most often employed to report troop movements, whether those of the Union or the enemy. Their stations were established on elevated positions, such as hills, tall trees, or building rooftops, wherever a broad view of the surrounding terrain could be obtained. When natural elevations were insufficient, artificial structures were constructed, including signal towers of considerable height. These towers, ranging from 100 to 150 feet tall, were particularly useful during the siege of Petersburg in 1864 for observing enemy troop movements. Although located behind Union lines, the open trestle design of the towers made them conspicuous targets for enemy long-range guns and mortar shells. Sometimes, the flagmen's courage was severely tested as they stood atop these precarious structures, waving their flags while enemy projectiles whistled past them. If a shot struck a tower, the chances of the flagman and his lieutenant tumbling to the ground were high. Engineers claimed the towers could stand even if 3 of their 4 posts were cut away, but fortunately, no significant damage was ever inflicted on these structures, despite the tons of iron fired at them. The roof of the Avery House near Petersburg also served as a signal station, often under fire from enemy artillery, much to the distress of the signalmen stationed there. Signal communication was essential during battles. Signals were used to request reinforcements, report troop movements, call for ammunition, and assess the effectiveness of artillery fire. In 1863, for example, a signal officer stationed in Suffolk provided critical information to a Union gunboat regarding the accuracy of its fire. The precise targeting forced Confederate General Longstreet to withdraw his troops, an outcome attributed to the signal officer's observations from the Masonic Hall in Suffolk. Signal towers also played a role in intelligence gathering. During the Chattanooga and Atlanta campaigns, Union signal officers managed to decipher the enemy's signal code. This enabled them to intercept messages sent between Confederate headquarters and their signal stations, providing invaluable information. Unfortunately, this advantage was lost in June 1864, just before Sherman's attack on Kennesaw Mountain, when a war correspondent revealed the Union's ability to decode enemy signals. The Confederates promptly changed their code, cutting off this vital source of intelligence. Sherman lamented the loss, estimating that the correspondent's indiscretion cost thousands of lives at Kennesaw. While Sherman wanted the reporter arrested and hanged as a spy, General Thomas instead exiled him north of the Ohio River for the remainder of the war. Signal stations were not always on towers or buildings. At times, they were set up in less conventional locations. For example, during the Battle of Atlanta on July 22, 1864, a signal officer climbed a tall pine tree to direct Union artillery fire. The officer nailed cleats up the tree trunk and built a small platform at the top to act as a makeshift station. However, when Confederate forces overran the position, they captured the artillery and killed the officer in the tree. At Gettysburg, during the fierce fighting at the Peach Orchard, Union signal flags flew from Little Round Top. As Confederate General Hood's troops pressed toward the critical position, the signalmen were ordered to keep their flags waving to create the illusion of a substantial force behind them. This deception, directed by General Warren, helped deter the advancing Confederates. The work of the Signal Corps was not without moments of humor. At Shiloh, Lieutenant Joseph Hinson, commanding the Signal Corps for General Nelson's division, established a station on the Tennessee River's far side. To maintain a clear line of sight, Hinson enlisted a guard from among stragglers, tasking them with keeping his view unobstructed. When General Grant unknowingly stepped into his line of vision, Lieutenant Hart, frustrated and unaware of who he was addressing, yelled, "Get out of the way! Don't you have any sense?" Grant quietly apologized and moved aside. Hart's embarrassment upon realizing he had scolded a major general can only be imagined. The Signal Corps contributions extended to naval operations as well. At Fort McAllister, Sherman sent General Hazen to take the fort by assault while he observed from a rice mill on the opposite bank of the Ogeechee River, where a signal station had been established. As Hazen's forces advanced, Sherman's signal officers relayed messages between the fort, the advancing troops, and a Union steamer arriving on the river. When the steamer signaled, "Who are you?" the response came back, "General Sherman." The next inquiry, "Is Fort McAllister taken?" was answered, "Not yet, but it will be in a minute." True to the prediction, the fort fell shortly afterward, and the news was promptly signaled to the naval officers on board. That concludes the 13th and last part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.